Gilgamesh, subtitled the Recovering the Masterpiece of Babylonian Literature because that's what it is. But first of all, we do have to ask ourselves the question, what is Gilgamesh? When fragments of the Epic of Gilgamesh were first translated, historians celebrated it as the beginning of human storytelling. Andrew George called it something far more dangerous. The moment humanity reopened a door that ancient civilizations had sealed for a reason, he said the tablets contained knowledge too specific to be myths, detailed accounts of creation, destruction, and the limits placed on human life. Astronomical references, a moon, a star, various symbols, which even could be symbolized as a wristwatch. Technology being used 6,000 years ago. To George, the epic was not humanity's first story. It was humanity's first warning. The unearthing of something that was never meant to be found. In 1849, British explorer Austen Henry Laird struck something strange beneath the sands of modern-day Iraq. His team had been searching the ruins of Nineveh, the capital of ancient Assyria, when they uncovered rooms lined with tens of thousands of clay tablets. The site became known as the Library of Ashurbanipal, named after the last great Assyrian king who ruled from 668 to 627 BCE. Many of the tablets were broken, some burned black by ancient fire, yet somehow the text carved into them had survived. These fragments would soon reveal the oldest story humanity ever told. For years, the tablets sat in the British Museum, gathering dust. Then, in 1872, a quiet museum assistant, George Smith, began studying them. Smith was self-taught, but he had a gift for reading the wedge-shaped writing called cuneiform. One afternoon, as he translated a damaged tablet from the pile, he froze. The words described a flood so vast it drowned all living things, leaving only one man alive in a great boat filled with animals. The man's name was Utnapishtim. Smith realized what he was reading. This was the same story as Noah's Ark, but thousands of years older. The discovery shocked Victorian England. People had been taught that the Book of Genesis was the oldest account of creation and the flood. Smith's translation proved that the biblical version had come later, because the clay tablets he studied were written in Akkadian during the reign of King Ashurbanipal around the 7th century BCE, and they were themselves copies of much older Sumerian and Babylonian stories dating back nearly 1,000 years earlier. That meant the Mesopotamian flood story already existed in written form long before the Hebrew Bible was compiled. The flood story first appeared in the Epic of Gilgamesh, written in Akkadian, the language of Babylon. The tale had been passed down for centuries, likely first composed around 2100 BCE by Sumerian poets who told of a mighty king, Gilgamesh of Uruk, who searched for eternal life after his friend Enkidu died. Scholars today credit a Babylonian scribe named Sinleki Unani, who lived around 1100 BCE, for compiling the final version that we now call the Epic of Gilgamesh. In the 11th tablet of the epic, Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh how the gods decided to destroy humankind because of their noise and defiance. The god Ea secretly warned Utnapishtim to build a massive boat and fill it with the seed of all living creatures. The storm lasted 6 days and nights until all of mankind had turned to clay. When Utnapishtim released a dove and a raven and they did not return, he knew the waters had receded. He made a sacrifice and the gods, smelling the sweet smoke, gathered like flies over the offering. It was the world's first recorded flood myth, and arguably its first apocalypse. Smith was overwhelmed by what he had uncovered. Witnesses say he jumped from his chair and ran through the museum crying with excitement. But only a few years later, he died suddenly of disease in Mesopotamia while searching for more fragments. Assyriologist Andrew George later remarked, "He opened a door we were never meant to open." What he meant was that Smith's discovery did more than reveal an old story. It challenged the idea that sacred history began with the Bible and showed that even its most divine events might have older human origins. If the flood story was not a unique revelation from God, but a retelling of something far more ancient, then what else in those clay tablets had been borrowed, rewritten, or deliberately changed before reaching us? The question would haunt every scholar who touched the tablets. It was not just a poem anymore. It was the first act of rebellion against the gods, and the next discovery would reveal how writing itself became a weapon against them. The epic that rewrote creation. When scholars first pieced together the opening lines of the Epic of Gilgamesh, Andrew George was among those who felt the full weight of what the ancient words revealed. He later said that the text does not begin where stories of creation are meant to begin. The prologue does not describe how the world or mankind began. It starts with Gilgamesh already alive, ruling, and partly divine. There is no moment of creation, no shaping from dust or divine breath. Humanity simply exists. To Andrew George, this detail was crucial. The line calling Gilgamesh 2/3 divine and 1/3 human was not just a poetic way of saying he was great. It reflected what the ancient Mesopotamians believed about human nature itself, that people were made from mixed origins, part mortal and part something higher, but never fully either. This idea completely overturned the later belief found in the Bible that humans were a pure and intentional creation of one God. In this ancient account, Gilgamesh ruled the city of Uruk, a walled paradise of his own design. He walked along its high ramparts and looked out at everything he owned, yet still felt hollow. His people feared him and called him cruel. George once asked in a lecture, "What does it say about us that the first king in human literature had everything except peace?" Like Adam in the Garden of Eden, Gilgamesh lived among abundance, but could not rest. The gods had given him power and knowledge, but not contentment. That endless hunger became, as George described it, the first human flaw recorded in writing. The Babylonian scribe Sinleki-Unnini gathered older Sumerian tales and reshaped them into one complete story about pride and punishment. In his version, the gods are not wise guardians, but jealous overseers who resent their creation's growing strength. When Gilgamesh's ambitions begin to rival their own, they send Enkidu, a wild man born of clay, to break his arrogance. To George, this was the first record of divine jealousy. An ancient warning that humanity's reach for greatness always comes with a price. Mesopotamian myths surrounding the epic were even darker. In the Enuma Elish, humans are formed from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god named Kingu. George explained that this was not a story of love or purpose, but of servitude. The gods created mankind not to share heaven with them, but to spare themselves from labor. Humanity was born to serve, not to rule. This grim idea, George believed, lingered through time, reshaped but never erased. During translation, he noticed that the earliest lines used a plural word for creators. That same plural appears in Genesis 1, where God is called Elohim, meaning the gods. George wondered if both traditions had drawn from a shared and forgotten source. A time when creation was the work of many powers, not one. If the epic that began in ancient Uruk could challenge everything mankind believed about its own beginning, what might be hidden in the verses that followed? The next scholar who searched for those answers would discover how dangerous it could be to understand what the gods once wrote. The man who tried to translate the gods. For most scholars, translation is an act of understanding. For George Smith and Andrew George, it became something closer to possession. Every man who devoted his life to the Epic of Gilgamesh seemed to leave a part of himself buried in it. Smith died at 36 in Mesopotamia, the same desert where the tablets had been found. Later researchers whispered that he died too close to the text, though the official cause was dysentery. What unsettled people was that several scholars who studied the tablets after Smith began reporting the same strange experiences. Some said they heard low voices whispering in Akkadian while they worked late at night. Others described vivid dreams filled with words they did not understand when they woke up. The sounds were rhythmic, like chanting, but no one could explain where they came from or why the dreams always stopped once they left the project. Andrew George, who would later rebuild the entire epic from over 300 broken fragments, worked mostly in silence. Colleagues said he became withdrawn, living like a man in exile. He described the work as a kind of haunting. Sometimes, while reading aloud from the tablets, he stopped mid-sentence and stared at the words as if they were changing in front of him. The epic itself seems to understand what language can do to a in-tablet, too. The wild man Enkidu meets a temple woman named Shamat, who has been sent to tame him. Enkidu lives like an animal, running with gazelles and drinking from rivers, untouched by human life. Shamat uses speech, song, and tenderness to draw him away from the wilderness. The text says, "The harlot spoke, and his mind grew wide." Her words awaken self-awareness in him, teaching him what it means to be human. It is one of the first moments in literature where language itself transforms a being's nature. George often said that line haunted him. It made him wonder if translators experienced the same thing, becoming something new each time they pull meaning from ancient words. He confessed privately that the more he translated, the less he felt like the author of his own sentences. "Sometimes I feel the text translates me," he told one interviewer. His notes began slipping from description into recreation. Instead of "Gilgamesh weeps," he would write, "I weep." When reading the line, "He who saw the deep," George began using present tense, saying, "I see the deep." Students noticed and thought it poetic. Friends thought it was exhaustion, but George himself said the words had a will of their own. In ancient traditions, words held power. In Jewish mysticism, it was believed that mispronouncing the divine name could bring madness or death. Andrew George often compared this idea to what he faced in his own work. The Akkadian language, used on the Gilgamesh tablets, was not an ordinary tongue. It was the language of priests and magicians, used in prayers, oaths, and curses. Translating it was more than simply reading. It meant speaking the same sounds that ancient scribes once used when they called upon their gods or tried to banish harmful spirits. George realized that every translation was, in a sense, a reenactment of those rituals. He began to wonder if the tablets had been written that way on purpose, not just to tell a story, but to perform something when read aloud. Near the end of his work, he began noticing something he could not explain. Certain passages would not stay consistent when he translated them. Each time he returned, the meanings seemed to shift. "You read them, and they erase themselves," he wrote in his notes. When pressed to explain, he described one fragment that seemed unlike any other. The text circled back on itself, ending exactly where it began, as if meant to trap the reader inside it. That was the only tablet he could never complete, and it became the one that haunted him most. The hidden tablet that shouldn't exist. For centuries, the Epic of Gilgamesh was believed to end with Tablet 12, the puzzling chapter where Enkidu somehow returns from death. The text shows Gilgamesh speaking with his long-dead friend, asking what life is like in the underworld. Scholars have struggled to explain it. In the previous tablets, Enkidu had already died, mourned, and been buried. His death came after he and Gilgamesh killed the bull of heaven and the guardian Humbaba, both acts that defied the gods. As punishment for their arrogance, the gods decreed that one of the two friends must die, and they chose Enkidu. Stricken with illness and terrifying visions of the underworld, he cursed his fate and died in agony. Yet in Tablet 12, he walks and speaks again. The ending feels disconnected, almost forbidden. It reads like an intrusion from another world, a scene that should not exist inside the same story. Andrew George often called Tablet 12 a problem that refuses to die. He explained that it was written in a different dialect and style, unlike the earlier tablets, suggesting it had been added later from an older Sumerian source. To him, it was not a simple continuation, but an interruption. "It is not resurrection in the holy sense," he said. "It is intrusion." The dead cross back over, but not because the gods allow it. The scene carries none of the peace of divine mercy. Instead, it shows a friendship that defies cosmic law, a human voice reaching into the land of the dead. For George, this was what made Gilgamesh extraordinary. It was the first story to ask whether love or grief could overpower death itself. Then a new puzzle appeared. In 2021, an archaeological team working near Mosul, Iraq, not far from ancient Nineveh, reportedly unearthed a small clay fragment written in reversed cuneiform. The markings appeared backward, as if meant to be read only in reflection. No official paper was ever published, but whispers in academic circles began calling it the 13th tablet. Photographs circulated privately, and George was said to have reviewed them. He never confirmed this publicly, but a student recalled him saying, "If it's real, it doesn't belong to the living." Linguists who examined the images claimed that a single line could be read, "He who reads awakens what sleeps." The pattern of reversed text resembled those used in ancient Mesopotamian funerary spells, particularly in the Descent of Ishtar, where mirror writing was used for messages meant for the dead. The rumored tablet did not continue the story of Enkidu. Instead, it seemed to comment on the act of reading itself. It seemed like a warning to anyone who tried to summon meaning from words that once spoke to gods. George refused to call it authentic, yet he never dismissed it. Some texts, he told a colleague, were not written to be read. They were written to be obeyed to him. Tablet 12 and the rumored Tablet 13 were connected not by story, but by purpose. Both challenged the line between life and death, one through narrative, the other through ritual. Andrew George's final conclusion about the tablets was not comforting. If Tablet 12 and the rumored Tablet 13 were connected, then they were not simply myths about death and return. They were warnings written in the language of gods and instructions that only mortals would be desperate enough to read. And if those instructions were not meant for us, the question he kept repeating in his notes was terrifying. What happens when the living read what was written for the dead? The gods who feed on death. The Epic of Gilgamesh is often read as a story about mortality, but Andrew George believed its real theme is far darker. It is not only about fearing death, he once said. It is about feeding it. When he studied the tablets closely, he found a repeated image. The gods taking pleasure in the scent of sacrifice. After Gilgamesh and Enkidu kill Humbaba, the guardian of the cedar forest, and later the bull of heaven, the gods are enraged. To balance the offense, they decree that one of the two men must die. Enkidu's death is presented as punishment, but George argued that the text suggests something else. The gods gather like flies over the sacrifice. That phrase, he noted, is the oldest description of divine appetite. This idea of feeding divinity through human suffering is not unique to Gilgamesh. It appears in the Bible too. In Exodus 29, God is described as taking delight in the pleasing aroma of burnt offerings. The Akkadian phrase Re'anashi used in the epic means the same thing, the scent of mankind. What both traditions share is the belief that divine satisfaction comes from death, that the act of sacrifice keeps the cosmos stable. In Mesopotamia, families left food and drink before the statues of their gods so that those divine figures could eat. Temples doubled as kitchens. The system of worship was built on feeding what humans feared most, which is the unseen forces that ruled their fate. George pointed to an omitted line he found mentioned in a damaged commentary tablet. They drink the scent of the dead. He believed this line was not symbolic, but a literal statement of belief. To the ancient Mesopotamians, the gods did not live on light, air, or divine power. They lived on the energy that came from death itself. The moment when life ended and something eternal was released. Every death, in their view, fed the gods and kept the universe balanced. This meant that Enkidu's death in the story was not just punishment for killing the bull of heaven. It was part of a system of giving. The gods demanded life and Enkidu became their offering. Gilgamesh's grief, his mourning, his tears, and even his storytelling became part of that same offering. Every time people remembered the dead or retold the story, they were repeating the act that fed the gods. The rumored 13th tablet seemed to confirm this idea. Its line, "He who reads awakens what sleeps," took on a new meaning for George. If Tablet 12 showed Enkidu's spirit speaking to Gilgamesh from the underworld, then Tablet 13 warned that reading those same words could cause the same thing to happen again. Each time the story was read or spoken aloud, it could symbolically call the dead back into awareness, keeping their presence and the power of the gods active among the living. George's conclusion was unsettling. If the gods gained strength from human grief, then they need people to keep mourning and remembering. Forgetting would starve them. Remembering keeps them alive. The Epic of Gilgamesh, he feared, survives for that very reason because it still performs the same ancient function. It keeps the cycle of death, memory, and divine hunger alive. If that belief is true, then immortality is not a gift from the gods, but their greatest threat. A world without death would end their power. And that, George believed, is why the Epic of Gilgamesh still endures, because the gods will not allow it to die. The epic that wouldn't stay dead. When Andrew George retired from teaching, he believed he had finished his life's work. But the Epic of Gilgamesh refused to stay still. Within months of his final lecture, new fragments began appearing. Some sold anonymously to museums, others surfacing in private collections with no clear record of where they came from. Each fragment added lines that scholars had never seen before, yet the grammar and vocabulary were undeniably authentic. The earliest of these surfaced in 2003, and they continued to appear well into the next 2 decades. Many of them contained characters that didn't match any known cuneiform style, as if they had been copied by someone who understood the language, but not the traditional script. To researchers, this strange revival felt almost supernatural. George described it as the text rewriting itself through history. Every generation seemed to discover just enough new material to keep the story alive. Scientists began using infrared and ultraviolet imaging to study damaged tablets, and the results made the mystery even deeper. Hidden beneath the visible writing, they found faint impressions. Ghost signs, as one researcher called them, that shifted shape under spectral light. In some places, new words appeared where there had been only cracks before. When scanned again days later, those same spots looked different. Then came the digital reconstructions. Artificial intelligence trained on ancient languages began generating missing portions of the text by predicting what earlier scribes might have written. The results were not random. The AI's versions produced new lines that made grammatical and narrative sense, as though the poem were completing itself through the machine. One program even produced a phrase that did not appear anywhere in the known record. "I am the one who endures," George said quietly. That is exactly what Gilgamesh would have said. The epic itself contains a scene that mirrors this uncanny survival. In Tablet 11, Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh of the plant of life that restores youth. Gilgamesh retrieves it, but before he can use it, a serpent steals it and renews itself instead. The plant's power is not lost, it simply changes form. George saw the same pattern in the epic's endurance. Each time the text is damaged, forgotten, or rewritten, it returns in a new form. Like the serpent, the story feeds on decay to remain alive. To some, the parallels became unsettling. Religious scholars compared it to the opening of the Gospel of John, where it says, in that passage, the word, or logos, represents divine speech that becomes life itself through creation. They argued that Gilgamesh behaves in a similar way. Its words keep giving life to the story every time they are spoken or read. In that sense, the epic became a pre-biblical version of the living word. Surviving through human memory and retelling, the story no longer needed its author. It lived through the people who kept bringing it back to life. George once said that every person who reads Gilgamesh becomes part of its rebirth. Each reading completes the ritual, he wrote. It lives through us because we cannot stop speaking it, which brings everything back to his final plea. Not to decode more, but to listen before the cycle begins again. Before I die, please listen. In his final public lectures, Andrew George often began with the same quiet words. Before I die, please listen. Those who attended said his voice carried a tone of urgency rather than farewell. He no longer spoke as a historian describing an ancient text. He spoke as a man who had seen too much inside it. What he revealed in those last years unsettled many of his colleagues. He warned that humanity was beginning to follow the same path that doomed the ancient quest for immortality, once carved into clay, was being rebuilt in circuits and code. George often reminded his students that Gilgamesh's greatest mistake was not his cruelty or pride, but his refusal to accept limits. When his friend Enkidu died, Gilgamesh could not bear the thought of an ending. He crossed deserts, mountains, and seas to find eternal life, only to be told that death was the fate of all mankind. Yet in modern laboratories, George saw the same hunger reappearing. Artificial intelligence, cloning, digital consciousness, and the dream of uploading the human mind into machines. All were new versions of the same ancient obsession. We are still chasing the thing that destroyed him, he said. In the final tablet of the epic, Gilgamesh realizes that the great walls he built around Uruk will remain long after he is gone. For centuries, readers saw this as a message about leaving behind a lasting legacy. Andrew George disagreed. He argued that the gods allowed Gilgamesh to build those walls not as a reward, but as a test. They let him believe he had conquered time, so that he would feel the pain of watching everything he created eventually fall. To George, the walls were not symbols of success. They were reminders that every human achievement, no matter how great, will one day disappear. He found that same warning echoed in the rumored 13th tablet. According to the few who claim to have read the line, it ended with the words, "He who builds again what was drowned shall again." George called it the most terrifying sentence ever written. It suggested that every time humanity tries to rebuild what nature or time has taken, it repeats the same punishment. Each civilization that rediscovers Gilgamesh eventually begins to mirror it, reaching for immortality, defying its limits, and collapsing under the weight of its ambition. For George, the Epic of Gilgamesh is no longer just an ancient story. It is a warning about the future. He believed the scribes who first wrote it understood a truth that modern people still ignore. Death gives life its value. Without it, love, courage, and purpose lose their meaning. He told his students, "Before I die, please listen." The curse of Gilgamesh is that we never learn. What he wants people to see is that the epic's message still applies today, even though no one is walking deserts in search of eternal life. Modern humanity tries to escape death in quieter ways, by chasing youth, clinging to technology, and building digital versions of ourselves that never fade. People pour their lives into screens, data, and legacies, hoping to be remembered forever. George warns that this obsession with lasting forever blinds us to the simple fact that meaning only exists because time runs out. His message is clear. The Epic of Gilgamesh was never only about one man's search for immortality. It is about ours, our constant attempt to outlive our limits instead of living fully within them. And that search, he said, is still happening.